Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer1745 here with my continuing playthrough of Hearts of Iron 3 with Black Ice 9.11, and of course we're playing as Japan. Now, one of the reasons I ended the last episode when and where I did was this, the formation of Meijing, and I, knew that it was the puppet state, and it was sort of Japan's puppet state for Mongolian ethnic peoples and whatnot. That I clearly knew, but I wanted to read up on a little bit more on it. Just the Wikipedia articles, nothing big, and I did that. And so, one thing I noticed is, not huge amounts, but there was some coal and some iron, I guess, to make steel mines in there. And at least the iron was all shipped directly out to Japan. And that's entirely understandable because there is little or no industry locally to take advantage of it. I'm sure there's some blacksmiths or something, but nothing on an industrial level in that part of China up in here. I really sort of wanted to have Manchukuo as an independent country, and yes, we can still let's politics, where is it? Create a puppet here, and we could create Manchukuo, and we may at some point, but not now. The main reason is gameplay, is that I wanted full access to the resources and the ICs here. Normally, you get any resources that the puppet doesn't use to yourself, but it gets its ICs. Now, not that we can quibble about details, but I like the system in Hearts of Iron 4 where you have various levels, dominions, some stuff that are basically in the almost independent states, but are, sort of forming the British Commonwealth, sort of self-governing territories, which we would clearly put Canada and Australia into that, where much more direct rule, at least in regions. Again, you've got to understand. Now, of course, this India here, and what was it? I was informed in 1937, Burma was sort of broken off as an independent thing, but it had long already been functionally its own thing. But the sort of classic India that we have here breaks into three states eventually. First two, Pakistan, which includes East and West Pakistan, but eventually Bangladesh breaks off in a war from Pakistan, and Pakistan is basically unable to fight Bangladesh because it's on the other side of India. And of course, there's some colonies. But if you were to really look at that there are sometimes, I think, some micro-states, less than a province here. But there are a bunch of regions in here, if we were to look at that, would be maybe even four or five provinces that would be a largely independent state. Some were more puppet states. Some were very sort of independent, so long as they behaved. Behave meant have reasonable laws, as the British would say, and as the British rulers would say, what they would consider reasonable laws, and not cause trouble, invade things, do things that were to disrupt the system. So long as they did that, they were their own government, their own state. Very few people recognized them internationally, diplomatically. But India was far from a united political system. And as I've said before, even though you've gone over from the British East India Company, I don't think, and there is definitely some element of it, but I don't think they ever unified the three presidencies of the British East India Company. One down here in Madras based, the other one up over here Calcutta based, and the other sort of Bombay based. Those were three different leaders appointed by the East India Company in London, and they had their own localized armies that sometimes they very much operated in conjunction with, but often they had, done their own thing. Sure, you're working for the company and you want the company to go well, so if you're disrupting the company's other business, that's a bad thing. But they're doing their own thing, so they had their own different rules, regulations, conventions. Because if you go back and look at before the main Indian Mutiny, and definitely in the 18th century, probably about half or more of the officer class in the East India Company's army units in most of the region were local Indians, moderately anglicized. They needed to speak a certain level of English and that kind of thing. But there was a lot of that, and a healthy amount of mixed-race officer types within it. It really, sort of post-Napoleonic period, that you get harsher and harsher racial lines for the Indian Army, and more or less by the time of the Indian Mutiny, all the officer class is English. And again, I'm saying this is a generality. Each regiment is its own thing, and like I was saying, the three different presidencies, they may be doing things at little different rates. And where a lot of the NCO class is still mixed, meaning European and Indian sergeants and whatnot. So it is not a unified state as we see it. So, but we lump it all in for its sort of dominion status. And so I like the idea of some of that, and I like the idea of requesting, demanding, whatnot, of your puppets' troops to your use, so that you can get Manchukuo units and keep them guarding the border of the Soviets, or send them fighting, the Chinese or whatever. I really like that. That is sort of part of the reason, if I were to turn these ICs over to Manchukuo, they would start trying to build Manchukuo in army units, and yeah, what good is that really for me to use? I would much rather have the stuff directed towards me, and I can decide how much garrison units, because we still have a lot of these cavalry units that are useful for anti-partisan and or invading China against light opposition. Obviously they're just fairly light stuff now. So looking at that, and I go, yeah, I'd rather have the ICs and the resources for both the coal and the steel, which are directly needed for me. But since there are no resources up here of note, like I say, and if it was, a level 2 or 3 coal and a level 2 or 3 steel, that wouldn't dissuade me from doing it. But so we're going to do the formation of Manjing, which is the most sort of common polite. Okay. Basic mobilization has been enacted as our new economic laws. Huh. Let's take a look at this here for a moment. Why did we lose that? National unity be at least. Neutrality is below 75. Quite honestly, I'm not normally worried about neutrality levels. Our neutrality is 79 is probably why. One part is known as democracy. Neutrality is below 75. National unity. So by forming that, Okay, you're going to see a screen go blank here. The game isn't ending, the game isn't crashing. We're going to reboot here because I don't want to lose that many ICs. And yes, I'm going to keep talking to keep reassuring you that things are fine here. And yeah, they still are fine here. We're just having a temporary blackout while rebooting. If I can do it without losing my neutrality, I would do that. Levels, because I want to have better, or going, you know, below. So I guess by creating a puppet means I'm being less imperialistically aggressive. Okay, yes, now you're seeing something on the screen. And we've loaded. Okay. So, let's do this little bit of radio we have. Okay, so yeah, we're not going to do that right now. Diplomatically, that's right. Like I say, I normally don't worry about it. Well, I don't know. This is our neutrality is still the same here. Full mobilization. We are full mobile. We currently have this. Well, we're going to keep full mobilization for a while we can. If it goes away, we'll see about going under, because I don't want to lose almost 100 IC just to have Beijing. Okay, Germany, we give them money for metal. No, we're okay for metal. Now that we got our ships working. And we have 2 heavy cruisers. Okay, light cruiser armor has advanced. Good. Yeah, that's too far in advance. Let's switch over to light anti-aircraft armament. That would be nice. Yeah, I'm just going to keep checking that to see if it's something else. Politic, create puppet. Well, not giving us as that. Okay, pre-war armor construction has advanced. That would be here. We'll let that go. I don't know how we have some armor, which there. These will get upgraded, so it's useful to do it. I have talked to a few people about possibility of buying production licenses from some other nations. Japan, definitely, like I said earlier, did do some licensed production, mostly in small arms. Their aircraft, they bought a lot of test aircraft, but mostly when they ended up building copies, they only superficially looked like what was it that we just got? Oh, anti-tank weapons for the infantry. Superficially looked like what the test the test aircraft looked like as in types, meaning they completely reworked things. So, you know, learned what they could and then sort of improved. No, we don't want to buy fuel. Talked about the possibility of buying like German tanks or something, but licensed production. Don't know how much or if anything. And my understanding, if you do licensed production, the unit stays at whatever it was. So if it's at a, you know, early model, maybe I talked about this on the, because I trust me guys, I get confused between the 2 Japanese series that I'm doing and what I've talked about recently. So if I haven't, but if I buy, say, tank licensed production from Germany, it'll stay at the model and time I've bought, where if I and we will let that continue to go, and supply production advance, which we're going to stop, and we're going to move that over to small arms, where we research it and then it will upgrade currently. And yes, I know a bunch of you are worried about and the likelihood of wasting some of my ICs on this, but we're almost done with much of the catching up upgrades. We probably don't need the police so much anymore, but I'm going to finish those units. Okay, so that's a one and done, and which will allow us to increase our support weapons. And I really like what Black Ice is doing with equipment and equipment models. Now mostly they've looked at aircraft and German tanks and ship types and whatever, so you can look at the historical equipment types and move through those. We don't need quite that many, so let's plow down to that. And light cruiser engines have advanced. Very good. That means they'll be fast. Well, we're going to do those not so much for the bombers, but for the float planes and such. Okay, yeah, that's too far in advance. We're not going to push ahead with armor like I would possibly do with Germany, because just to the realization we're never going to be really winning or losing so much by the armor, because I don't think we can compete unless we were really going to throw off using some other techs. Oh yeah, machine guns, that'd be good for our fighters. We're successfully doing a lot of research, but maybe it's more prejudiced of my historical knowledge, but Japan had some very good development teams, and they did some very good research. Probably the best example in aircraft is the A6M, the Zero, as we know it. I wouldn't call it the best aircraft of its day, but it is a really good aircraft of its day. So definitely one of the best flying aircraft in that it flies really well. But that isn't the only thing that makes up what a good fighter is. So, it's far from unbeatable. And been sort of reading into some of this stuff, and I'm sure we'll get into more of it. And again, you hear me talk about it. One of the reasons the British, and to a lesser extent the Americans, very early on did so poorly, as well as the Dutch did so poorly against the Zero, often with American Brewster Buffaloes and other sort of aircraft that was deemed by the British to be not frontline service for Europe, and a lot of it was sent to Asia long before, because maybe the 40s. So sometime 1940. You got a year, maybe more, before the end of 1941, and a lot of the battles that we're talking about aren't really even happening until early 42. They're steeped in the dogfighting tradition coming out of World War I, and at least some of the pilots are coming out of the sort of British, Battle of Britain and such. And most of the competing aircraft of the day, especially the ones that we're facing, I don't know, because there were no Spitfires and there were no 109s, Messerschmitts fighting against the Zero, so that could really be a different thing. There were a few Hawker Hurricanes, which we know is a good aircraft, but isn't quite Spitfire. Those aircraft are not able to dogfight a Zero and win successfully on any sort of they definitely shot down some Zeros and some aircraft, and they also shot down other aircraft as well, bombers and other army fighters that just aren't as good, but they're not aircraft that are able to maneuver and dogfight and win. I don't know, Lieutenant Thatch or somebody. Thatch, an American pilot, a squadron commander, comes up with what gets to be known as the Thatch weave. And okay, let me see if I can describe it with this hand, because of doing my two hands, you can't see. Let's say there's one of your aircraft flying along this side of the square here, and the other, his wingman or whatever, is flying along this side. And a Zero, say, comes from behind this one here, this guy then, realizes it. He flies in this direction, so the Zero follows him in this direction, and this aircraft flies in this direction so as to shoot across the front of a high deflection shot, not from behind, but shooting across at the zero. So and they could also do this with two groups, two aircraft on either side that would deal with it. So you would and they would just weave back and forth. So the zero is behind him. This guy's not trying to turn and shoot him, but just keep jinking about the sky to make a hard target, but generally flying in this pattern so that this guy can cut him off. And then once he's over here, and if he's still being followed, he then flies back this way, and this guy's so they're weaving back and forth. The Americans after a while stopped this because their aircraft are just so fast. They outfly the Japanese with no need of a thatch weave, and that is sort of how the I'd probably have to look it up again to explain it, is how Chenault's Flying Tigers, the Americans, score so heavily against the Japanese. And a lot of their aces are also becoming aces from, again, shooting down non-frontline, first-line Zero fighters, because the Zeros are mostly they are only a Navy aircraft, and I don't think there's many Zeros. There are some, I think. Not sure on that are flying here, but there are other good Japanese models that are flying over here, and since they're using the P-40, which is much faster than, say, a Brewster Buffalo, they're just simply using speed and diving in on the Zeros and engaging them and just pulling away. Whether they succeed or fail in their attack run, they just pull away and use their speed to get away from the Zeros and have and other fighters, and have really good success at that. And so the Commonwealth, because there are a bunch of Commonwealth pilots, some are coming, getting, I'm sure some, because this is late 41, that are being either trained by, or there's a few, survivors of the Battle of Britain are out here. But there's also a lot of the conventional wisdom, including Dutch pilots who aren't from the conventional wisdom of the Battle of Britain, but are coming from the World War I dogfighting conventional wisdom. And so they're just fighting the wrong air fight with the Zeros, is why they do so poorly against the Zero. And some of the other first class, the Nakajima, I believe, is the Army fighter. I forget the designation. Those are also good, but not as good as the Zero. They're doing support. The Chinese is just really poor training, really poor morale, and often poor aircraft is why they do so poorly. I think the Soviets do all right against the Japanese, because if you know the history of sort of China, through the 20s, there's a certain amount of German military missions to China. It gets ramped up a bit more in the 30s, so the main sort of advisors are German. Remember, Germany doesn't have an official air force, so they don't really do too much, I think, on any sort of aircraft selling or whatnot to them. You see most of at least the German aircraft that I know are sort of transport and light bomber types that are sold to like Manchukuo and whatnot. But those are after the Nazi regime. So Germany is sort of the main advisors. Germany pulls out as Germany gets closer and closer to Japan, and after the real war sort of breaks out between China and Japan. Before that, Germany is looking to maintain a good relations with the nationalist Chinese in a sort of grand anti-Comintern pact kind of thing, even though the Chinese won't sign it because it's bringing them in too much of alliance with China, which they're having an ongoing war, even though it isn't, before the Marco Polo Bridge incident, there's a lot of little incidents, literally like 100 or more within a year that are going on, often with Manchukuo and type patrols and scouts and whatnot in this sort of zone, and these are going on all the time. Again, mostly not Japanese soldiers, often a few Japanese advisors / officer types are testing, are pushing the de facto boundaries against China, and of course China does claim Manchuria, so they're seeing it as an occupied zone. So China, even though there isn't a hot war, there's only a cold war going on at times, really. So China isn't going to go into an alliance with Japan, but Germany is still looking at trying to isolate the Soviets. So they want to keep a strong China, as opposed to have, the communists or other socialists or other types. And you also have to remember as well, especially in the 20s and the early 30s, you get the Chinese nationalists that are highly anti-Western. And they it's more pragmatically change their approach. They don't want, the concessions in Shanghai. They don't want any of the, they throw out lots and lots of missionaries and lots of, unarmed, mostly there are some killings, but mostly throwing them out. And unarmed merchant types that are, Europeans that are dealing with the trade within China, and they're throwing them out at various times during the period, of whatever region they're in. So the nationalists have this sort of anti-Western bias that Germany is taking advantage of. That then, like I say, gets withdrawn once the war with Japan really heats up and becomes the war post Marco Polo Bridge incident. Then the Soviet Union steps in. The Soviet Union under Stalin is a pragmatic concern, as you can see, where they work to get control of all of the communist parties everywhere. One of them they have influence in, but they really don't get control, is of course Mao's party. They do have some advisors to that, but they believe that the nationalist Chinese are going to win, and so that they see the Chinese nationalists as a revolutionary party. Again, they're throwing out the Western commerce, Western missionaries, and they want to sort of encourage that type of stuff. They would like to have an ally in China, and of course they're pragmatic in that they would like the combat experience for their pilots, and some combat experience for their ground officers, sort of leading and observing and whatnot some Chinese units. So they, at this time, they're also doing similar sorts of stuff in Spain, the Spanish Civil War. So they also do it in China. Now, I'm not exactly sure why, but at some point, and it could just be and as I'm thinking about this, because I really haven't read much up on it, could be either gearing up for or the actual invasion of Russia by the Germans that really sort of makes it that they have to withdraw for their support from China. But they leave behind literally tons of munitions, lots of equipment, including things like artillery pieces, maybe not in large numbers of artillery pieces, but fairly large numbers of aircraft, though once you withdraw the Soviet ground crews, the Chinese we can see and we know, the Chinese culturally are a well-developed people, but they're not necessarily widely spread knowledge and ability of modern mechanics and motors and engineering. Of course, they have expert of all of these things, but they're not, again, widely spread to have a lot of good ground crews. So throughout the whole experience, No one is ever able to, in large numbers, to train up ground crew or pilots. They try. They try. They try. They try. They're never able to do it. And there's various reasons for it. But they're never able to do that. Now, you know, and I think some of it may be for the pilot situation. I think it's a class situation, meaning they sort of get told, oh, here are your pilots, trainers, whether they be probably not so much German, but Soviet or Americans or whatever. Oh, and they may be all sons of the elites. And, oh, you can't wash him out because his father is the banker or something like that. You know, it's a lot of pull within Chinese society, and which is still going on to this day, to my understanding, in you know, the People's Republic of China, particularly. You know, sort of who you know or who you are is more important than your competency. And so, you know, you can't wash him out because that would be a loss of face for his father, and his father supports the government, and it would be bad. So you know, so you get this situation in where you can never get excellent pilots. And you know, you can probably pull up, there are a few, but they're, for the size of the population and even for the size of the numbers of aircraft sent to China for Chinese use, you can never get you know, a significant number of very good pilots. A few pilots. And the reason I say that there is not just that they don't have competent pilots, they have a lot of crashes, you know, on landing and takeoffs from these aircrafts. And they aren't necessarily fatal and aren't necessarily incapacitating the aircraft from being fixed. You know, meaning that they're coming down mostly good, but something sort of goes wrong and, you know, sort of have a minor little crash that the aircraft needs to be repaired. There's a lot of that going on with the Chinese, and it just never works out. No training program ever does. And we can even see that most of the, I think, most of the shoot downs of happening over Korea are really Soviet pilots, you know, flying Chinese marked aircraft over, you know, the Korean War. You know, things change. I don't know the quality of People's Republic or the Republic of China pilots, but I'm sure it's changed. It's just more, I'm talking of the period. And it has nothing to do with the race, though of course many people mistake it for that. So there's a lot of pressure. And I also kind of sort of think it's as well for the pilots, because if you look at a lot of the developed nations' use of pilots, they give them a lot of theory and a lot of actual sort of deep education. They don't, for the most part, get you know, schoolroom education. It's not just, oh, can you fly this thing through the air and can you get behind the enemy and shoot them down? No, they give a lot of classroom, and there are a lot of NCO type pilots out there that aren't, you know, university graduated, but on overall education levels of general knowledge, elementary school students in America, at least, are much more educated than most Chinese. And just also, when I say this, an elementary, you know, school student in America in the 1930s is more like a high school, or just, you know, just before you go into university school education. Education levels have gone down very much in America. Because if you were to look at the tests, if you were to look at the books that they had to read back in the 20s and the 30s to get through elementary school, and compare them to the high school, you know, the upper levels of high school education and that kind of thing, you'll find the older elementary schools much harder, much more facts condensed in them that they had to know in the tests, and that, so much better educated for the levels. The American education system, and I'm talking, well, it's gotten worse since I've gone through there, but it's gone down, and for various reasons. very, very poorly. So used to be much higher levels of education for that, and the Chinese education system just doesn't function that way. And it is not a broad-based education system. Sure, there is, at this time still the remnants of the Confucian class of the mandarins and whatnot, of the educated people. But even those people, that they're highly educated, they're not necessarily practically educated, with the, shall we say, the concept of science. Of having a theory and testing it out and going through. They don't necessarily understand it. Their education is in the Confucian system. So it doesn't lend themselves to being good mechanics and figuring out problems and how to problem solve and how to fix these things. And so their ground crews, just on a large scale operation for it, are just never very good. So once the Soviets are withdrawn, and you really get Chenault showing up just a few months before Japan enters, attacks the U.S. and Britain, to the point that there's still a one squadron, I believe, of Chenault's fighters, forget which one, whether it's the Hells Angels or which one, is still in Burma and fights in Burma primarily. And at that point, they want to continue to fight in Burma to try to keep the Burma Road open and protect it there. And so that he knows he has to bring in all of his own ground crew and support staff. Now, of course, they can use a lot of Chinese labor, and the Chinese can do a certain amount of work under immediate supervision. If you need two sets of people to hold something while a third, does something, yeah, you can get two Chinese and they can learn and be, assistant types, but they really can't keep this stuff up and going. And so we looked at, now how do we start down China and Chenault, and hope that was all fun. The education in China. The different fighter abilities. So the reason the Japanese are having so much victories against China is that China has bought large amounts of aircraft in the 20s, in the 30s, from various parts of the world at different times, has a spotty record of maintenance. Again, they've hired some trainers to come in from different countries, and they've hired some ground crew technicians to come in and train. And yes, they have some people that can do some levels of basic maintenance, but they don't necessarily do, and there may be, some of it may be that they're very conscientious, but they've got 20 aircraft to maintain, and for whatever the squad is, they can maintain 2 or 3 aircraft effectively. And, they just never are able to keep up enough stuff. So the Japanese get really good training and learning experience fighting the Chinese because they're so much better at it. And so the Japanese get a lot of that going on, and even when they're fighting against the Soviet pilots and whatnot, they've got a little better equipment and things, so they do fairly well against them. And you got to also remember, the Soviets aren't giving first line aircraft to China. They're giving their old stuff, older model types and things like that. So that's sort of why Japan does so well against China front. Now, of course, we see as time goes on, as particularly the Americans, but also the British and their Commonwealth allies, but most of the production is British. Their fighters just really start taking out the Japanese. And the Japanese, I would say, biggest failure point is the lack of pilots. Not the lack of planes, or even, well, it's sort of a contributing factor to the lack of pilots, the quality of airplanes. The Americans learned that if you sort of shoot at the bottom of the aircraft where the two wings connect with the fuselage, basically the aircraft explodes. And so you kill the pilot as well as taking the airplane out. and you hit anywhere but straight on the aircraft, basically, and you know, a bullet goes towards where the pilot is on the aircraft, you're going to kill the pilot because there is no armor for the pilot. Where the American aircraft, and goes more so as time goes on, they have armor plating behind the seats of the pilot and behind the head, and it gets more and more, like I say, as time goes on. And I think much of that armor plating will not stop the 20mm guns, again, those are license-built Oerlikons, in the Zeros from punching through and taking out the pilot. But it will generally stop the I think they're mostly 7.7 caliber machine gun rounds, and it will stop when the 20mm round hits and blows up and send fragments around. It'll stop some of the, you know, the fragmentation from hitting. So you get a lot of wounded American pilots that are still, well, some that, you know, obviously they bail out of the aircraft too, but a lot of them are still able to get their aircraft back, whether that means they're repairable or just cannibalized for spare parts, but they're back. And see, if an American pilot is super valuable, and so if you get him back, and even if he's shot up so bad that he's never going to be a combat pilot again, you can ship him home, get him well enough, you know, in a few months, most likely, and you can put him in a classroom, and he can start training more pilots. Or you can even put him, you know, if he's well enough but not going to be a fighter pilot, you can put him up in the air as a training pilot in the U.S. So he's done with his combat part of the war, but he's still fighting the war by training more pilots. Where in Japan, if your pilots are killed, there's no ability to do this. Now, there is no good system for training Japanese pilots. The Japanese pilot school washes out so many pilots because they just want the best, and so they keep washing out lots and lots of pilots, you know, in the fighter pilot schools, and they just want the best. And then you get to 1943 or so, and the Japanese pilots are realizing, man, all those people that we washed out in the past are much better than the new guys that were sort of flooding into us, being put into aircraft with very limited training. Had we not washed those guys out because they didn't quite meet up to standards and had a larger pool of pilots, and part of also they have a problem with aircraft production. I've talked about some of this before, and I will in the future. But for sure by 44, but probably in 43, you're out producing fighter aircraft. You're producing more fighter aircraft than you can produce reasonably good quality fighter pilots in Japan. Pilots become the main failure point. Now, part of that is lack of fuel, and that gets worse and worse as time goes on. So the sheer number of flying hours that you can fly gets worse, and it's often limited not because of the lack of aircraft to put them in, or even, shall we say, maintenance to maintain those aircraft, which is a cost to do it. It is simply the lack of fuel suitable for even basic flight, because you can put in most aircraft, you can put in automobile engine fuel and fly the thing. There was I think it was a Pan American clipper ship, the big flying boats, that was one of the, not Guam, but maybe here or somewhere, and got trapped, out in the war, and maybe it was in Australia at the time or somewhere. It was somewhere out in the Pacific here, and it sort of gets trapped, and the war, and it takes off. This is in the very, very early days of the war, and so it either flies to or was starting out in Australia. And it wants to get home, and it realizes to try to go back across the Pacific is to go through the war zone. So they want to get this very valuable aircraft home, And so there's no, at this point, there's no passengers. There's just the flight crew. So they fuel up in Australia and then fly to, I think it's here in Batavia, but it's somewhere in the Dutch East Indies. And they come in with very little fuel. And the Dutch officials at this time, and the Japanese aren't, I mean, the Japanese are fighting in here, but they haven't taken this territory yet. This is sort of the, again, very early, and, you know, it's still sort of kind of safe. They come in. The Dutch officials refuse to give them any, and it's sort of by this time almost more Allied officials, but refuse to give them any aviation fuel. So they pump all their remaining aviation fuel into one tank and seal that up, and then put in standard, you know, car gasoline, octane fuel into the rest of the aircraft, and then, because it's a flying boat, so it has to take off out of the water. So they basically use that one reserve tank or whatever of aviation fuel to get themselves airborne, because that's the hardest to get airborne, is the hardest struggle of a flying boat, to break that contact with the water and get a reasonable amount of climb out of it. So they take off on their very sort of limited amounts of aviation fuel to fuel 4 major engines. So I mean, there's a bunch of gallons. I don't know the number, but there's a bunch of gallons of it. It isn't fumes or anything like that, but it's get that thing up, and then they go, they get airborne, and they fly from there to I think it's Sri Lanka here, all on regular gasoline engine fuel, and land here, get aviation fuel from here, fly to somewhere around here, and then fly across Africa, I think, to here. And, oh, they had borrowed like $500 from an Australian banker, presumably that the company was going to pay them back. And then they fly over, I think it's to Brazil, and now they're finally back into sort of the Pan American support system and get, you know, money and whatnot, and they're able to fly back up through South America, up into the U.S. to finally get this. So this is a around the world, basically, aircraft flight to get this large, valuable seaplane, which has military uses, because basically the Clipper system, I think it does keep going for a while to Europe, places like Portugal and whatnot, while they are, the U.S. is still neutral. But as time goes on, they're using these Clipper ships to fly mostly military or other high-level government officials to and from places like Hawaii or England or wherever. So it's, you know, they end up being war use aircraft, but they have to get them out there. So yeah, you can run a Zero, I presume, you know, with regular car fuel, but it doesn't perform well. I mean, a Zero is such a light performing aircraft that I'm sure you can get them airborne and you can fly, but you can't quite get these really good top speeds out of them, and that goes for most of the aircraft. So you can run them on that, you know, for training purposes. You can, you know, get just flight hours on some sort of trainer to fly them around, which is different than using high-level aviation fuel, but Japan doesn't even have that. So this is just all a huge problem for training. And so when they had the fuel, when they had the training set up, had they trained additional pilots, because even those that graduated through their really tough naval school, and this is all focusing on naval aviation as opposed to, and I just haven't read any books focusing on the Japanese Army aviation, but there was sort of the fighter pilots, 2 basic levels, those that were and this is before starting the war with the Americans, 2 basic levels, ones that were not only gone through the basic training for carrier operations, but were selected for carrier operation squadrons. A bunch of other fighter pilots initially are not considered good enough to be for carrier aviation fighter pilots, because some of the fighter pilots of the Navy or fighter planes of the Navy do not have the ability to operate off of carriers. They don't have the tail hooks and some of the other stuff. They're, you know, land-based fighters, and they are proper fighters, not just transports or you know, 2 or 4 engine naval bombers that are big or something. They're also doing those things too. but it's a very hierarchical organization even within that. And so, it just, things get worse and worse for Japan, and they just don't have the mindset, but neither does Germany have the mindset for mass training of pilots. It's really the U.S. that industrializes, if you will, or however you want to describe it, pilot training, and they turn out so many pilots. I know I have a Remington semi-auto shotgun that's made like the Browning. It's looks like a Browning. It has all different internal stuff in it because they were wanting to have something that operates like a Browning but not step on any of Browning's patents. But it's all U.S. Government marked and made during World War II, and I don't know anything beyond that about this shotgun. So it's a civilian long-barreled semi-auto. Normally that would be 3 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber, so more or less 4 rounds, or is it 2 and 4, whatever. It's like that. It's not a military gun. It's long-barreled, and it's all U.S. Government proof marks on it and property marks on it. And I just know the general use, I don't know what this gun is been used for, but the general use for these guns were for training pilots and gunners. They would often ride in the back of a pickup truck with sort of a brace standing thing, so you could stand, so if it hits a bump or something, you're safe. You sort of have a thing going along, driving, often done in the American Southwest, so often sort of out in the desert where it's open, and driving along in that at a reasonably good speed, shooting at targets, sometimes, stationary targets on the ground, other times, targets thrown up by, mechanical arms, like skeet and trap type targets. So you're moving, the target's moving, and you're training to shoot at it. And so it's deflection shooting, something I'm not particularly good at. If you've seen some of my tank stuff, I was more of a trained to wait for the squirrel to stop and shoot it, or shoot at target, stationary targets. I'm fairly good at shooting at stationary stuff with real firearms. But so again, my fairly beat up copy of the gun I have, from the period. But that's the type of use those very civilian-looking weapons were used in America that were government-owned. And I know it's from the serial number and time range to be from the World War II period. And this is all part of America's industrialization, if you will, of training programs for air crews, which that includes fighters, it includes radio men, navigators, gunners, bombardiers, whatever it is. They were industrializing it. No other nation ever gets, not just into the scale because the U.S. is so big, but even into the well-organized machinery of doing it. I just don't know, because we don't know lots about what's going on in the Soviet Union. And if there are a bunch of books, most of them haven't been translated into English, so I don't know the Soviet pilot training setup. So I just don't know. But we know in places like Australia and Britain, they're not as bad as Japan is in this really small elite, small classes, whatnot. But they're nowhere, even for the size of population, even if scaled down, they're nowhere near the Americans' efficiency of getting it going through it. But it's better than the Japanese. But it's not at the American standard. And like the German standard, if you look at it, look around for photographs of German training aircraft. You'll find almost zero, because the Germans really didn't have training aircraft. Part of the problem for German pilot training was the loss of all the Junkers Ju-52s, the transporter craft, because those were 2-seat aircraft in which they used as trainers. So are you going to train the air crews, or are you going to fly supplies into Stalingrad? And then once you start flying supplies, but it actually starts some of the problems with flying parachutes and get paratroopers and landing troops into Norway that are getting shot down, or into Crete that are getting shot down. And a lot of these transport pilots are basic pilot trainers. And then they, once you get sort of good enough that they think you're not going to crash aircraft, you're a competent pilot, then they start training you in older models of regular fighters. Or, as we've seen through Revolver Hell's mod, sometimes they're using new fighters straight out of the factories temporarily to, fly them around. Again, but they're not two-seater trainers. They're regular models that are being used as trainers. So the Germans never set up, they don't have something equivalent to the Americans' T6 Texan, which is the most predominant monowing sort of fighter trainer type that never is used, in my understanding, by the Americans as a fighter, but they, I think, make like 10,000 of them. Okay, so again, I'm maybe wrong, but it may have been 20,000, or it may have been just 5,000, but it's probably like about 10,000 T6 T6 Texans trainers. Are two-seat. They look sort of like a mid or early 1930s fighter aircraft. They're not all that aerodynamic. That's the main monowing. There's also, and I forget, a biplane type that's a bit cheaper to produce, and those again are like I think 5,000 of them are produced during the war period and are used up until the end of the war as trainers, and those are much more introductory flight trainers. And one of the reasons the Americans want to use things like that is they have just one engine, so less maintenance on them, less fuel costs, and so you get these guys up there just basic flight trainers. And so if you look at, again, 10,000 fighter type aircraft, or some number like that, and I'm almost wishing or thinking I should get more into, looking up these facts for this kind of stuff as I'm doing them, but we'll see about that for the future. They're able to build that many trainers in America of a aircraft type that are never used in combat, or not much, if anything. I'm trying to think, Air National Guard or some sort of equivalency Air Coast Guard type stuff, maybe, that they would fly along and drop some sort of depth charge bomb on submarines in coastal USA or something like that. I'm thinking they might have. I just can't remember. But none of these are sent anywhere overseas to engage the Japanese or the Germans, overseas. So, the U.S. has that sort of scale of training just for that, and nobody else really does it to that scale. Britain does have training aircraft, but again, and it's more appropriate to their smaller national scale, but they even stop producing most of those things because of the need to, produce everything they can for the Battle of Britain. And then once that sort of gets over, not too long after that, America is in the war, and they're even already bringing in things like the T6 Texans. And yeah, that some of those might, because I know they did give them over to the Commonwealth. Who knows, they maybe sent some to the Soviets, but as trainers, those, because they did have the ability to mount a couple of wing machine guns in them, and many of them I think did have wing machine guns put in them, but those are again training, fighter pilots in training roles, and some of those could have been used in some combat, but not by the U.S. Well, this episode's gone on long enough, and I hope interesting enough. I want to thank you all for watching. Thank you for liking the videos. And if you haven't already, but you made it to this far, please subscribe to the channel. Love to see you around more often. And please do post questions, comments, suggestions, tips, and corrections, because I know I've gotten some of those details wrong. Love to have them posted below, the corrections. See you next time for more Hearts of Iron.